Hello, I'm Helen, and I recently celebrated my 30th birthday. Years ago, I decided to marry a man who had quite a few issues, naively believing that my love could resolve all of them. I thought I could show him his worth, but unfortunately, love has its limits and cannot compel someone to love themselves. I'll refer to my ex-husband as Scott. He had an intense obsession with pleasing his parents, a drive that went beyond the usual desire to make them proud. His entire life was overshadowed by this compulsive need for their approval. Scott's parents, whom I'll call Mr. and Mrs. Kyle, seemed indifferent to his life, which only made him more desperate for their attention. It was painful to see, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I couldn't fill the emotional void they left in him. To complicate matters, Scott frequently used our savings to buy expensive gifts and vacations for his parents, draining our finances on items they hardly appreciated. This reckless spending became a perennial source of conflict between us, and it often felt like I was vying with his parents for his focus, which took a heavy toll on our relationship. Despite the myriad issues and the endless disagreements, I still had feelings for Scott. I held on to the hope that he might break away from the unrealistic expectations set by his parents and find true contentment within himself. It became painfully clear that my love alone wasn't enough to shield Scott from the negative influences of his parents. Things escalated one day when Scott approached me with a serious look, signaling that he had something significant to discuss. Given the roller coaster of our relationship, I braced myself for something drastic, sensing this conversation might spark our most intense disagreement yet. "Helen, there's something important I need to talk about," he began with a grave tone. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart sinking in anticipation of bad news. "It's about my parents. They're retiring soon, and I want to surprise them with a luxury vacation. It's going to be quite expensive," he revealed, his face a mix of excitement and anxiety. "That sounds nice, as long as the money comes from your personal savings. I really don't want to dip into our joint savings again," I responded, hoping to steer clear of another financial argument. "I don't have enough to cover it on my own. I was hoping we could use some of our savings," Scott admitted, his expression torn between hope and concern. "Scott, if it's more than we can afford, maybe we should reconsider this expense," I suggested gently, trying to anchor him back to reality. However, my words only upset him. "You just don't understand, Helen. I love my parents and want to do something special for them. Love isn't about counting every penny, it's about grand gestures," he argued with passion. I countered, "But love is also about being there for each other and making sacrifices together, not at the expense of our financial stability. This trip might be important to them, but we need to think about our future too." Scott remained adamant. "I have to do this for them. I thought you, of all people, would understand. They're everything to me," he implored. "And you're everything to me, Scott, but we have to be practical. We can't just use all our savings on one trip," I reasoned, searching for a middle ground. Instead, he accused me of being selfish and not seeing the importance of his gesture. "It's not about being selfish, it's about being sensible and planning for our future," I explained, my anxiety growing as he mentioned he needed all of our savings. "All of our savings, Scott? That's just reckless," I exclaimed, stunned by his request. "You're being heartless," he shot back, convinced I couldn't grasp his desire to make his parents happy. "No, Scott, I'm being realistic," I replied, feeling the chasm between us widen with each word. "We can't afford to spend $35,000 on a whim," I stated, my patience wearing thin. His nonchalant assumption that we could simply get the money back later only deepened my irritation. "Really, Scott? That's not how this works," I replied, my disbelief palpable. We were deadlocked, and our perspectives on love, responsibility, and finances were poles apart. The argument escalated, voices raised, and in the heated moment, items were hurled and shattered, our frustration manifesting physically. Amidst the turmoil, Scott dropped a bombshell declaring that if I couldn't support him, he wanted a divorce. He likely expected me to react with panic, desperate to salvage our marriage. Instead, I summoned all my calm and resolve and simply said, "Okay, Scott, if that's truly what you want." The shock was evident on his face. He had anticipated tears and pleas, but instead, he met my unwavering stance. I was done catering to his fantasies. If he chose to squander his future on unattainable dreams, he would do so alone. I held nothing back, expressing my thoughts clearly. His ceaseless pursuit of his parents' approval was futile, like trying to stay dry in a storm with just an umbrella. He attempted to counter, but I silenced him with a simple raise of my hand, declaring my refusal to continue fighting for a love hindered by unrealistic expectations and an incessant need for validation. "Go ahead, spend all your money trying to win over people who barely notice you," I told him, resolute in my decision to end the cycle of disappointments and broken promises. With that, the stark reality struck him. Our marriage had morphed into a battlefield, and it was time to surrender and seek peace separately. A month has passed since our divorce was finalized, and I must say, the sense of liberation is profound. Gone are the exhausting arguments over finances and the futile quest for approval that was never ours to claim. Now I breathe easier, freed from the oppressive weight of his insecurities that once clouded my days. Each new day now shines a bit brighter. True, Scott has attempted to re-enter my life, feigning concern and inquiring about my well-being, but I see through his charade. I'm not about to be deceived again. As the old saying goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I resolutely turned away from Scott's attempts to rekindle our past relationship. I had come to understand that I invested too much in trying to mend someone who had no desire to change. It was now time to prioritize my personal growth and happiness. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, to say the least. Splitting our shared assets and adapting to a new financial reality required patience and resilience. Although I was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, I was no stranger to adaptation and welcomed the challenge to reshape my life. As I embarked on this journey of self-discovery, I uncovered a strength and independence I never knew I possessed. Reconnecting with old friends, resuming hobbies I had put aside, and exploring new interests opened up a world brimming with possibilities. I was determined to seize this fresh start. Yes, there were moments filled with self-doubt and loneliness, and adjusting to a tighter budget was tough. The scars from a failed marriage don't vanish overnight, but with each day, I found solace in knowing that I was no longer compromising my happiness to cater to someone else's insecurities. The relative ease with which I moved forward was perhaps indicative of how long I had clung to a relationship that was doomed. It was astonishing to see how much I could achieve once I was liberated from that emotional burden. A month into this new chapter, I was still adjusting, but feeling more empowered than ever. Amidst this transformation, Scott's messages took on a new tone. He claimed he was in danger and urgently needed to meet. Weary of his relentless attempts to reach out, I decided it was time to address the situation head-on. Amid his ongoing pleas, I called him. "Scott, we've been over this. We're divorced. It's time for us to move on," I said with firmness. "Helen, please, I just need a moment to explain. I'm in serious trouble, and you're the only one I can turn to for help," he implored, his voice perhaps carrying a genuine tone of fear. Or maybe it was just the absence of hearing his voice that made it seem so. Whether it was the long silence since our last heartfelt conversation, or his seemingly sincere distress, a part of me was intrigued yet cautious about his intentions. Despite my reservations, I agreed to meet Scott. "Fine, but we're not meeting at my place. Let's go to that cafe we used to frequent. No tricks, understood?" I stipulated. "Thank you, Helen. I promise I just need someone to listen. You're the only one who understands me," he replied, sounding genuinely relieved. You might be wondering why I would agree to meet Scott after everything that happened. Truthfully, I questioned my own decision. Yet sometimes curiosity and a lingering concern, no matter how faint, compel us to act against our better judgment. I couldn't completely dismiss his plea. Divorced or not, I couldn't deny that part of me still cared. So there we were, sitting across from each other in the cozy cafe, enveloped in the comforting aroma of coffee. However, not even the familiar, soothing environment could ease the tension. Watching Scott, with anxiety etched across his face and those deliberately sad eyes trying to tug at my heartstrings, was almost comical. This time, though, I remained unmoved. I leaned back, composed and in control, prepared to listen, but determined to keep the conversation on my terms. "Okay, Scott, you have my attention for now. What's this danger you're supposedly in? Just so you know, I'm not here to save you. I'm done cleaning up your messes," I stated, my tone firm yet open to hearing him out. Scott sighed deeply, his face a blend of regret and desperation that was almost pitiable, but I steeled myself against any emotional manipulation. "I know I've made mistakes before, Helen, but this situation is different. I've gotten involved with some seriously bad people. I owe them a lot of money, and they're not known for their patience," he confessed. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical of his melodramatic tale. "Really, Scott? Dangerous people? Are we revisiting the tale of your imaginary friends who seem to attract trouble?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. Scott's expression shifted to one of hurt and frustration, evidently hoping for a more sympathetic response. "No, Helen, this isn't made up. I'm in deep trouble and coming to you as my last resort," he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Let me guess, you spiraled after our divorce," I continued, piecing together the predictable pattern of his post-separation choices. As Scott shared his predicament, my voice unintentionally rose, attracting the attention of other cafe patrons. I shot them an apologetic look, trying to regain my composure. "Look, I got caught up in something foolish, I admit, but now I'm in a mess that's bigger than I can handle alone," Scott confessed, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. My frustration was close to boiling over. How could he just waltz back into my life with yet another crisis? Yet, beneath my irritation, a faint shadow of empathy lingered. "How much are you in for?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. $120,000, Scott responded sheepishly. $120,000, Scott? Are you out of your mind? My outburst was louder this time, drawing sharp glances from around the cafe. I didn't bother with an apology. Anyone overhearing our conversation would likely understand my reaction. "Helen, please, I'm begging you. I've got nowhere else to turn. I know I've made a mess of things, but you're the one person who really believed in me," Scott pleaded, his eyes glistening with a sincerity that momentarily reminded me of the man I once loved. But those days were long gone, and my priority now was self-preservation, even if it meant walking away from him. "Don't pull at my heartstrings, Scott. It's way too late for that. When you said you needed help, I thought you meant maybe $20,000, not $120,000. You've completely lost it," I responded, my voice a mix of disbelief and indignation. Overwhelmed, Scott began to cry, seemingly oblivious to the uncomfortable glances from other patrons. "Scott, calm down. This isn't the place for a scene," I said firmly. "What's going to happen if you don't pay this back?" "They're threatening to harm me, Helen. I'm not joking. This is really bad," he managed between sobs. His words hung heavy in the air, leaving me torn between my lingering concern for his well-being and the need to protect myself from being dragged back into his chaos. Seeing the seriousness of his situation, I was forced to consider the gravity of the risk he faced. I softened my approach. "All right, Scott, start from the beginning and tell me everything," I urged gently. He then recounted his attempts to fund an extravagant trip for his parents. He had borrowed money, trusting a friend who ultimately let him down, plunging him deep into debt. As he narrated his missteps, I felt a mix of frustration at his reckless decisions and a reluctant amusement at the outcome. "So, you borrowed money from risky people to impress your parents, who hadn't even noticed your efforts? Is that what happened?" I asked, seeking clarity on the sequence of events. Scott's expression fell and tears streamed down his face as he faced the painful truth. Yes, ever since they went on that trip, it's like I don't matter to them, he confessed, his voice laden with regret. Even though I was irritated, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him. It was a harsh lesson for Scott, and seeing him so remorseful stirred a compassionate response within me. You've really gotten yourself into a tough spot, I remarked. Scott, I know you don't want to hear "I told you so," but you did create this mess yourself. I warned you it wasn't a good idea, and now, after choosing to leave me over it, here you are, struggling. You invested everything in trying to make your parents happy, but all you received in return was their indifference. It's a hard lesson, but it's one you needed to learn, I explained, feeling a mix of concern and resignation. This was a bitter truth for both of us. Scott had pegged his self-worth on people who couldn't appreciate his sacrifices, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I couldn't shield him from his own decisions. I hoped that confronting these tough consequences would help him realize that I had always been on his side, but his relentless quest for parental approval was his undoing. As we sat in silence, the weight of our shared past, filled with broken promises and unrealized dreams, was palpable. I realized it was time to completely let go. No more second chances, no more attempts to mend what was beyond repair. Scott needed to confront the outcomes of his actions on his own, and I needed to move forward and find my path to happiness. I hope you find a way out of this, Scott, I said, my voice carrying a firm tone of finality. You're not going to help? Scott asked, looking genuinely surprised. No, I'm not, I replied. Why not? He pressed. Because I don't have the money to bail you out. And even if I did, taking on a huge loan that I'd be paying off for years isn't something I can afford. I can't afford to be as reckless as you've been, I explained, my tone steady and unwavering. Come on, Helen, please, I'm begging you, he pleaded, his desperation palpable. Scott, expecting me to fix this for you, especially given how you're acting, isn't realistic, I said, feeling my patience thinning. Yeah, I did expect that. You're my ex-wife, not my enemy, he replied, still clinging to a shred of hope. But it was clear our lives had taken different paths. My focus now was on securing my peace and happiness, separate from the chaos that once intertwined our lives. And that's the problem, Scott. You expect me to always be there to clean up your mess because that's what I used to do. I was your wife, so helping you out of trouble was something I did naturally. But I can't and shouldn't keep doing that. It's not my responsibility anymore, I continued. After everything, I don't owe you anything, especially considering how our money was wasted on your ungrateful and toxic parents, I added. But I love them, Scott said, his voice softening. And I love myself too. Loving myself means doing what's best for me, including taking care of my well-being, I countered. Scott looked down, realizing that he wasn't going to get the help he wanted from me. Understanding his bleak situation, I offered one last piece of advice. Since it seems like you're out of options, here's one piece of advice: leave. Move somewhere far away where they can't find you. I'm unsure what more you're asking of me, Scott, I said, my tone steady yet resolute as I faced him. He sat in silence, visibly upset by my decision to decline his request for help this time. It's time for us to separate paths, Scott. I can no longer allow myself to be ensnared in your troubles, I explained, hoping he would grasp the gravity of my words. We each need to pursue our tranquility. His reply came with a hint of bitterness. You would help if you really cared, he argued, his voice laced with anger. I'm saying farewell, Scott. I'm also changing my phone number, I announced determinedly as I got to my feet. Walking away, I left him there, sitting alone, his face a complex blend of emotions. It was a hard yet crucial choice I had to make for my happiness and dignity.
It was time for dinner at my in-laws' house. My sister-in-law, Oaklyn, who had been away for some time, had finally returned home and joined us at the table that night. The food was set out in front of us, and I watched as my mother-in-law, Ren, father-in-law, and Oakland picked up their utensils and enjoyed the meal. Then my sister-in-law stopped and stared at me. "Aren't you going to eat anything?" she asked. Without hesitation, I responded, "No, I'm the wife. The leftovers will be sufficient for me. Isn't that correct, Ren?" Oakland was in shock, but my mother-in-law was more concerned with the food than what I was saying. After what she witnessed, my sister-in-law began to see her mother differently. "My name is Piper. I'm a stay-at-home mom who juggles a part-time job, managing the house, and raising my child. My husband is frequently away on business trips, so I am left to manage things alone. Of course I can't complain. We're in love, and he earns enough money to keep the house in good condition. My main concern has always been my mother-in-law, Ren, who lives within walking distance. She often calls me over for insignificant things. The laundry's piled up, so come and wash it for me," she demanded. "In the garden, grass has sprouted. In front of the station, there's a new cake shop." She constantly requests that I run errands for her. It's only natural to need help at times. I could forgive her if she did these things once in a while, but it has become multiple times a day. Honestly, her constant demands have started to annoy me. I wouldn't mind helping her if she had health issues or some other reason preventing her from doing it on her own. However, my mother-in-law is in perfect health, save for her obesity, but she hasn't reported her weight affecting her ability to function normally. At my in-laws' house, I am treated as though I am a maid. My father-in-law, unlike his wife, adores me. However, he is completely unaware of the way she treats me. Ren only calls me when he's out of the house. When I let my husband know about this, he claimed that he would talk to his mother about it, and he has. He's warned her time and time again, but she, on the other hand, would make a fuss about it. She would say, "Well, Piper promised that she would help me, but when I asked her to, she changed her mind." Instead of expressing regret, she would cry and claim that I hated her and that she was the real victim. After several times of going through the same thing, I felt awkward bothering my husband with it anymore. I knew that he was working so hard, and I felt guilty asking him to help me repeatedly. Eventually, I stopped asking him. Perhaps this is what Ren wanted, but either way, I was now in a place where I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was going through, and I spent my days alone dealing with her. As of late, her demands have increased. One morning, I was made to clean up my in-laws' garden. She instructed me to cut branches from the trees in the yard and gather them all up. It was exhausting work, especially as the sun crept higher into the sky. I was sweating, but I couldn't stop to drink. By the time I was able to take a break, I went inside the house to find that it was past noon. Ren was laying on the sofa in the living room, completely relaxed, watching TV and eating chocolates. Her t-shirt was covered in wrappers. "I'm hungry. Make something for me from whatever's in the fridge," she ordered, not taking her eyes off the television. I sighed. As I walked into the kitchen, I laid eyes on the mountain of dishes that had piled up in the sink. "You'd better get started. My friends are coming over tonight, and I want the whole place to be absolutely spotless. There's no time to dither," she continued, devouring more sweets. I asked her to assist me, even just a little, but she didn't care to respond. When she was uncomfortable with what I said, she pretended as though I was not even there. Soon enough, I cleaned up the dishes and prepared fried rice for the both of us to eat. I set the table and placed both plates on it. "Fried rice again? Can't you think up anything else?" she resented. Even though she complained, she began to eat her meal with gusto. I too was starving, but I was hoping my husband had messaged me, and I checked my phone before eating. By the time I put my phone down, I was shocked to discover that the plate I had placed in front of me had vanished. My mother-in-law was devouring my meal. She had already finished her own. "Excuse me, ma'am, but that is my food," I said aloud. By this point, however, Ren had already consumed more than half of it. "I'm still hungry. It's your fault that you only cooked a small amount of food. You're just the wife, after all. You'd think that you'd make more, considering you know the wife eats after the rest of the family's finished. But no, you don't even comprehend that." She quickly devoured the remaining fried rice without waiting for me to respond. There was nothing left. No rice, no vegetables, no meat, nothing at all. "Now start cleaning up," my mother-in-law ordered. "My friends will be here soon." With that, she got up and marched back to the sofa. With a loud tear, I heard her open a bag of chips, spilling pale yellow crumbs onto the rug beneath her. I vacuumed the floor quietly, watching as the machine sucked up the potato chip crumbs. I couldn't help but picture the vacuum as Ren, swallowing up all the food and every last bit of my dignity, leaving nothing behind. I tried my best to relieve my hunger with water as I cleaned up as I had been asked, but the thought was clear in my mind. I swore to myself that I would never help my mother-in-law again. No matter how much she would beg and plead, I would never assist her again. If she wanted a maid she could command, she could try and pay for one. As for me, I couldn't do it any longer. I would not return to help her, or so I thought. Things changed dramatically soon after that day. My father-in-law had passed out at work, and in order for him to recover, he needed nursing care. My father-in-law had always been a thoughtful and caring man. From the time I was introduced to him all those years ago until now, he had always been kind to me, unlike my mother-in-law. "I had assumed that you were going to provide us with a grandson. I was foolish to think that you would give us an heir. Absolutely foolish." When I was pregnant with my first child, Ren would say these things to me. But my father-in-law would chastise her. He silenced her when she complained about our living situation while we were building our own home. He was always concerned about how I was doing and always offered his skills and advice to us when we needed it. When I learned that my father-in-law had fallen ill, I knew I had to act. I put on my coat, and I was determined to offer the same care in return. But the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. "You wicked wife! When were you going to show up and help me care for my husband? Don't you care at all? How ungrateful!" she angrily accused. I tried to tell her that I was on my way there, and that I was going to go even if she hadn't asked me. I could hear her start to continue her yelling, but I hung up the phone. I was already worried enough about what my future would look like. If taking care of my father-in-law meant bearing this burden a bit longer, I would do it, I thought. I went to my in-laws' house to assist with his care. As expected, Ren didn't seem to take his care very seriously. After his flare-up at work, my father-in-law had become partially paralyzed on his right side. He maintained some of his autonomy and could use the bathroom on his own, but he required assistance with meals and bathing. Since this meant he needed care throughout the day, I would drop my child off at daycare and go straight to my in-laws' house. I made breakfast for my father-in-law, washed his sheets and bedclothes as needed, and so on. I then tidied the house and prepared lunch. It was difficult work, but knowing that it was for my father-in-law made it much easier. Even still, my mother-in-law would not resist. She insisted on criticizing everything that I was doing. She would make a fuss into my ear while I was preparing food for my father-in-law. "This is something for sick people to eat. Can't you bother making something more regular?" she grumbled. "This food isn't for you. I'm making it for Dad," I retorted, trying to keep calm. "You're in good health, and you can make your own food. As I said before, I'm only here for my father-in-law's benefit. And beyond that, I'm here because you will not take care of him. I believe that you're able to take care of yourself, at the very least," I concluded. How rude," she shot back, stumbling over her words. "Do I need to remind you that I have the right to leave this house whenever I want? I don't care what happens to him. That all will be your problem if I leave. Make me dinner," she demanded. Her rage bore into me, and mine was swelling in my chest. But she was right. I couldn't risk forcing her to leave. Every care facility in the area was completely full. Even the wait lists were long. As things were, I couldn't be the sole carer for my father-in-law full-time either. Despite my resentment and desire to rebel against this woman, I had no choice but to submit and make food for her. She devoured it instantly. "Oh, I'm so full," she exclaimed. "Here are your leftovers to eat." Ren slowly laid down on the low sofa, leaving me to eat. My gaze moved to the pan, inside which there were only a few pieces of cabbage and a handful of noodles. Not enough to feed an adult, not enough to feed a child. It was pitiful, but I didn't want to waste the food, so I ate it on a small plate, as though it would make the food appear larger. Of course, it was completely insufficient. I ended up eating a sandwich I had brought from home before I finished folding the laundry and made my way to my father-in-law. I noticed that his face was red, his eyes wet with heavy tears. "I'm so sorry," my father-in-law said, his voice trembling. He must have overheard what happened in the kitchen. I asked him gently to confirm what I suspected. His pained expression said it all. He nodded his head yes, and the shame in his expression was too much to bear. "It's because I've become so ill," he said, his voice filled with helplessness. "That's why she's treating you so poorly." No, I softly assured him. "Please, you've been very good to me, treated me as though I were your own. I could never see you as a burden now, and you're not to blame for any of this." He nodded again in response, thanking me. I felt sorry for him when I saw him like that. That very night, I received a phone call from my husband's sister, Oakland. I'd only met her a few times before. My sister-in-law lives with her husband in another state. She and my mother-in-law don't get along well, so she doesn't visit very often. "I'm sorry, Piper, for all the trouble. I should go home to my parents' house right away, so that I can be the one taking care of my father," she explained. It had appeared that she had heard about my father-in-law's condition, and that she called me once she discovered I was the one taking care of him. On the other end of the phone, she apologized profusely. "I was merely doing what your father would have done for me, and I hope you don't mind," I said. However, Oakland seemed concerned with something else. "My mother, she began hesitantly, choosing her words, and quickly added, "You've had quite a rough time there today, haven't you, Piper?" My sister-in-law, like my father-in-law, is wise. She likely knows that my relationship with Ren has been strained since I've been spending more time taking care of him. I really do appreciate her concern, though it makes me wonder. My father-in-law, Oakland, and my husband, they are all such kind people. Why is my mother-in-law so cruel? I wondered. "Yes, I'm fine for the time being, though," I uttered, trying to reassure her. I let the conversation drift, but my sister-in-law seemed to sense the pain in my voice. After a few moments of silence, she said, "I'll be returning home at the end of the year. I'll let my parents know so you don't have to worry about it any longer, Piper." To be honest, I was exhausted. Housework, childcare, part-time work, and caring for my father-in-law every day. It was enough as it was, but also preparing food and cleaning for my mother-in-law, listening to her words full of hate and disappointment. I was feeling trapped. If something hadn't happened soon, it would have broken completely. So Oakland's words were very reassuring to me. However, until then, Ren stayed the same. In fact, she was actually becoming worse. As the end of the year approached, my mother-in-law would tell me to clean the kitchen, exhaust fan, wash the screen door, and complete other bothersome tasks. She never took into consideration that I had my own house to tend to as well. It was like my life outside of hers didn't exist. I wouldn't have time to prepare a dinner for us all on New Year's Eve with my cramped schedule. So, I spoke with my husband and we decided to order it online. "What a waste of money," my mother-in-law uttered indignantly. "If you're going to be someone's wife, you ought to know how to at least make food. What are you good for?" Of course, Ren was not pleased. "You're a wife too." I wanted to scream at her, but I couldn't. I didn't want my father-in-law to overhear us arguing. I didn't want him to think that this was all his fault. I managed to calm her down by promising to prepare the New Year's Eve meal myself. Oakland arrived at the house on New Year's Eve. She was alone. "It's your first time home in years, and still you have nothing to show for it. You're all alone now. Whatever happened to that pathetic husband of yours? Did he divorce you for taking his place as man of the house?" Ren hurled insults at her daughter without even saying hello, but when I saw Oakland, I felt that familiar presence. It was as though I was looking at my own reflection as I saw her calmly respond, "I couldn't bring my beloved husband here with me. I couldn't bear you being as cruel to him as I knew you would be. Anyways, I came home to see my father, not you." After saying this, Oakland quickly departed into my father-in-law's room. At this rate, the New Year's dinner was not going to go very well. I had made a few dishes, but by dinner time, those dishes were more lively and pleasant than the people present to eat them. The only sound I could hear in the quiet living room was a pot simmering softly. I served my father-in-law some food, Wren began to greedily eat the boiled meat on her plate, as if on cue. Oakland only looked on coldly. My husband had been attending his company's end-of-the-year party, and he wasn't with us on that night. Had he been there, the atmosphere might have become tolerable or even upbeat. He always brought that to every room he entered. I was wishing for this as I hopelessly assisted my father-in-law the best that I could. "Piper, why aren't you eating?" Oakland asked, turning to me. I was seated at the table, yes, but only for my father-in-law. There were no plates or utensils available for me. She must have been perplexed, but this had been my life for some time now. I smiled through my pain and told her, "Don't worry, I am the wife after all. A wife must be content to have the leftovers once the family's finished." Wren nodded to my sorrowful words. My stomach ached. "You are," she said, her words muffled by the food she was actively eating. She was preoccupied with the meat and thoroughly uninterested in conversing with us. I was curious how she could act like this and still have no shame. Disgusted by her attitude, I made a sarcastic remark. "Though you are a wife as well, why are you eating now? The family's not yet finished." Before Wren could react, I was surprised to see Oakland stand. "Mama will need to eat a lot of meat while she still can. She won't be able to eat such expensive food if she's kicked out of the house." My eyes widened. Oakland presented a document, a single packet of papers that would change everything. They were divorce papers. My father-in-law appeared to be in on all of this as I watched the two of them make eye contact. At last, Wren's hands came to a halt. "Father's divorcing you because he's finally run out of patience. He's been accepted into a very nice care facility and is planning on selling this house as soon as he's moved in," my sister-in-law concluded. Wren nearly spat out her dinner. She hurriedly swallowed her mouthful and looked at her husband and daughter. "If you dare do something like that, you'll have hell to pay in alimony," she yelled, her face turning red. "I'm afraid that's not going to be an issue. If you insist, though, we can take you to court over it. We have ample evidence of your disregard for the needs of the family and the neglect of your husband," Oakland replied calmly. My mother-in-law was enraged, but when the word court was mentioned, her attitude swiftly changed. I'm sure she was well aware of what her disadvantage would be if things came to that. "I'm sorry for everything," she whimpered, her voice now weak. It was as though she was a different person. She kneeled on the spot, begging for forgiveness. Oakland and my father-in-law, on the other hand, had nothing to say to her pitiful display. She kept apologizing, but there was nothing that she could do. All of us in that room knew that she was in the wrong. "You'd better get started signing these papers. Once you're done, you can pack your things and leave the house," Oakland demanded. She was relentless. The years of abuse had welled up within her, and she would not back down on her demands. Wren would be packed and gone, leaving her alone in the freezing New Year's weather. It had seemed that my mother-in-law was also abusing my father-in-law on a daily basis. She would berate him, telling him that he was worthless, and that she wished he would have just passed away, instead of becoming such a burden. My father-in-law was very smart. He kept track of her daily outbursts, and organized them with the help of his daughter. The data they had both accumulated was crucial in fighting their case in court. By the end, the claim was settled by offsetting it with a share of property, leaving Wren homeless. She currently lives in a rundown apartment and is working part-time to get by. She has become a different person in her struggle. She hasn't been able to afford many nice foods and has lost much of her weight, but she is even less healthy now than before. My father-in-law now spends his days living in a luxury nursing home, run by a friend of Oakland. They see to it that he is not only healthy every day, but happy too. He's made friends with many of the other residents. I pay him visits at least once a week. His progress has been astonishing. Thanks to his rehabilitation, he's regained more movement in the right side of his body. He smiles more frequently, laughs more. It's wonderful. I have made a friend too. My sister-in-law and I have become close, and we communicate often. We both want, more than anything, to keep supporting my father-in-law as best as we can. We will treasure the peace that has finally come to us.